All right, let's dive right into one of the most fascinating and enduring debates in American religious history, the story behind the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're going to be looking at an analysis by a writer named Alan Spedding, who takes a hard look at the arguments of a major critic. This is where faith and fact really go head-to-head.
So, right from the get-go, the author Alan Spedding makes his approach crystal clear. He's not here to give you the final answer. He's basically saying, look, don't just take my word for it, and definitely don't take the critic's word for it either. The whole point he's making is that the real answer has to come from a more personal source.
So, who are the two main players in this intellectual showdown? Well, it really boils down to two key figures with two very different goals. On one side, we have the critic, Bill McKeever, from an organization called Mormon Research Ministry. And on the other, the believer, our source author, Alan Spedding. And this is where it gets really interesting, because their missions are in direct opposition. McKeever's goal is to use critical analysis and evidence to persuade people to leave the LDS Church, but Spedding? He flips that on its head. He's trying to use the exact same kind of analysis to build a case for the faith. So this isn't some friendly academic discussion, it's a real battle of beliefs.
Okay, so where does this whole debate kick off? Well, it starts with something you can supposedly touch and feel. The gold plates, which are said to be the source for the Book of Mormon.
The critic, McKeever, comes at this from a pretty straightforward angle. Physics. He's like, look, if these plates were solid gold of the size described, they'd weigh close to 200 pounds. There's just no way Joseph Smith is casually carrying that around. Makes sense, right? But Spedding's response is all about the details. He points out that the historical accounts don't say solid gold. They say the plates had the appearance of gold. And that little difference is huge. It opens up the possibility of a lighter gold alloy, something like tumbaga, which would bring the weight down to a much more manageable 40 to 60 pounds.
And Spedding doesn't stop there. He throws a few more things into the mix. First, you've got to remember, Joseph Smith was a young, strong farm boy. He wasn't some frail academic. Second, think about adrenaline. The stories say he was being attacked by people trying to steal the plates. And then there's the biggest factor of all, at least from a believer's perspective. What about a little divine assistance?
And that really gets to the heart of the believer's argument, doesn't it? Spedding poses this really powerful question. If you're someone who can believe in a miracle as massive as the parting of the Red Sea, is it really that much of a stretch to believe God could help someone carry a heavy object? It's a fascinating way to frame the debate on what's believable.
Okay, so we've talked about the plates themselves. Now let's shift gears and talk about the people, the witnesses, who claim they actually saw them with their own eyes.
And we're not just talking about Joseph Smith's word here. There were 11 official witnesses who put their names on the line in formal written testimonies, all saying, yep, the plates are real, we saw them.
But, of course, there's a debate about what seeing actually meant. The critic, McKeever, argues it was all just a vision, something spiritual and subjective, not physical. But Spedding says, hold on, not so fast. He argues that if you actually read the accounts, you find both. Some experiences sound like spiritual visions, sure, but others sound very, very physical.
So, for instance, you've got the testimony of the three witnesses. It says the plates were shown to them by the power of God. And you can see how that language totally plays into the critic's argument that this was a supernatural, maybe non-physical event. But then you have the 8 witnesses, and their testimony couldn't be more different. It's so direct, they said they handled the plates with their own hands. And that's Spedding's whole point, right? You can't just write off all the testimonies as just a vision when you have a whole group of people saying, nope, we physically touched them.
All right, this is where the debate moves from physical evidence to something much more philosophical. It's about how we even decide what's true in the first place. At the very heart of the LDS faith is this idea called Moroni's promise. Basically, it's an invitation written right inside the Book of Mormon itself. It says, hey, read this book, think about it, and then just ask God sincerely if it's true. And the promise is you'll get an answer. It's a very direct, personal approach to finding truth.
So what does the critic do with this invitation to pray? Well, according to Spedding's analysis, Bill McKeever flat out refuses to do it. He apparently calls the very idea an affront to God, basically seeing it as a psychological trick or a form of emotional manipulation.
And this is Spedding's countermove, and it's a pretty powerful one. He puts Moroni's promise right next to a super well-known verse from the New Testament, from the book of James, that says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. The point he's making is pretty hard to miss.
This idea of asking God for answers isn't some strange new concept, it's right there in the Bible.
And that leads to what is maybe the central logical challenge of the whole analysis. Spedding is basically asking, if it's a normal and accepted act of faith for a Christian to pray to know that Jesus is the Christ, then why is it suddenly wrong, or an affront, to use that exact same method to find out if the Book of Mormon is true? So, after laying out all these arguments and counter-arguments, Spedding doesn't just leave it there as a matter of opinion. He actually tries to quantify it, to wrap it all up with a final scorecard.
So here's what he does. He breaks down the key issues, the plates, the witnesses, the path to truth, and assigns points based on how strong he thinks each argument is. Now, obviously, this is his own system, his own metric. But in his final count, the arguments for Joseph Smith's claims come out way ahead, 440 to 150. It's his way of putting a number on his conclusion.
At the end of the day, what this whole thing really boils down to is a clash of two totally different ways of knowing something is true. You've got one side that says, show me the hard, physical, empirical evidence. And you've got the other side that says, personal, spiritual revelation is also a valid and powerful form of evidence.
And that's really the big question this whole thing leaves us with, isn't it? When a story claims to be both historical and divine, when history and divinity collide like this, what do you use as your ultimate standard of proof? How do you decide what's real?